This is Living in Color, a series about PoCs, which stands for People of Color, that looks at how our everyday experiences are shaped by the color of our skin. In this episode, we're going to look at stereotypes and identity, what it's like to be called something like whitewashed and face casual racism. Welcome to Living in Color. I'm your host, Farah Nasser, and I'm joined by Cole Forrest, Teeshia Sheldrick, Dennis and Sidrah Ahmad. Now, most PoCs, people of color, have heard 5 words in their life, these certain 5 words. Where are you really from? And I know at this table, you've all dealt with stereotypes and casual racism, and that's what we're talking about today. So let's get right to it. You have been called Oreo. You have been called whitewashed. Tell me about those experiences and how they've made you feel.
Yeah, I think growing up, it's certainly terms that I heard a lot more as a youth and as a child than now in adulthood. But still, it was very tough growing up and hearing those terms, because being called whitewash or an Oreo, you start to question, who am I really? Am I not who I'm supposed to be? Am I supposed to fit into a certain I don't know, personality trait, or am I supposed to be or have a certain type of behavior? So for me, it was really hard to grasp as a kid. You know, I got over it as I got older, but it was still something that was really hard to stomach.
How did it influence how you dressed, how you spoke? How did it influence things like that?
I think for me, I tried to then go against how I felt comfortable. So, you know, growing up in an era where I love hip hop music, but growing up in the era where the baggy clothes were the big thing, that's what you're supposed to wear. I started dressing that way, but not really feeling comfortable in it. You know, I was more, this is more my style, like the button-up shirts, and even being told the way I spoke wasn't really proper, or it was too proper for someone of my skin color. So that was kind of hard to deal with when you're growing up and a kid trying to figure out who you are.
And there was a point in school where you just went home. I mean, wearing cardigans, you didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, I remember being in middle school and just feeling the pressure of, you know, my classmates just making fun of me and saying all these things about me. And I just had enough one day and just left. Just walked out of class and just had enough. Right. So it was really hard.
You know, words matter and words hurt. And Teeshia, I want to turn that over to you, because you really were measured in how you spoke. People said that you were almost too eloquent, or you shouldn't be speaking a certain way. Tell us about that.
Well, there was one particular incident when I was in the car with my friend and her sister, who I'd never met before. So we were driving in the car, and my best friend, she still is, she was just saying a lot of things. She was talking like she usually does, and she was saying like dude and yo, and then all of a sudden her sister just slams on the brakes, turned around, and she looks directly at me, and she's like, you need to stop teaching her to speak black like you. And I honestly froze. I was in complete shock, because she doesn't know anything about me. I don't even speak that way. So I kind of froze, but then my friend stood up for me, so she turned to her sister and she's like, Teeshia doesn't speak like that. Like, she speaks really white. And then I was
like, what does it do with this information?
Exactly.
I speak too black, I speak too white, you know?
So I was just like confused, and I was like, I didn't know the way I spoke was like, had any correlation with my skin color.
Right. I'm going to turn it over to you, Sidrah. You are a Muslim woman. What kind of stereotypes have you faced growing up, and how did you combat them?
I think for me, growing up, the biggest stereotype that I was faced with and that I felt like I had to disprove all the time was the idea that as a Muslim woman, or a Muslim girl at the time, that I was oppressed, that I was weak, that I would have to be soft-spoken, that I wouldn't have any opinions, even that I wouldn't be able to do sports. So there were a lot of stereotypes that I was really aware of from comments from classmates and sometimes even teachers. And so I felt like...
What kind of things would they say to you?
Well, I remember hearing a teacher once talking about, saying, oh, you know, Muslim women... I was sitting out of gym one day because I wasn't feeling well, and the teacher seemed to think it was because I was Muslim. And so, yeah, from there, set on a course, like kind of like what you were saying, to disprove it. So I became very outspoken. I was doing a lot of sports, but I've been thinking about that more lately as an adult. Like, if you're working really hard to constantly disprove a stereotype, it's still kind of restricting. Like, maybe some days I do want to be quiet, you know, and it's not because I'm a quiet Muslim woman. I just want to have a quiet day, right? So. Yeah, those are the ones that I grew up with, and I was also the only visibly Muslim girl in the school that I was a part of. So I felt like a lot of eyes were on me, and so everything I did had to really disprove stereotypes, or show people that I'm more than what they think that I am. So it was a lot of pressure. Yeah.
Cole, you are part of the Indigenous community. Tell me about some of the stereotypes you felt externally, but also internally.
So it's always push and pull as an Indigenous person, especially in a colonized world where, in this new generation, post-residential school, we're sort of coming back into the culture. There are a lot of elders who do know the culture in so many ways, but they're stuck in their old ways. And so on reserve, I get the pressure of not being Indigenous enough, not dancing, not taking up the culture. They're like, you don't know the language, so how can you really be an Aboriginal person? You can't understand, It's really looking down on your poor Indian type thing. You're not the same Aboriginal as I am. And I'm like, we're all living in this. We're all living on these dirt roads in a secluded place. And so why can't you accept me for who I am as an Indigenous person? And so on the outside, it's, I went to a high school, Chippewa Secondary School. We were the Chippewa Raiders.
Which is also a problematic name.
Which is a very problematic name.
Yeah.
And I didn't really, I guess I became desensitized to that, so I didn't really understand that until I was out of it and had a outsider's look into it and how awful that really is. And so, I would be pulled into these meetings where it's like, do you think it's time that we get rid of this? Like, do you think that we should get rid of this?
Right.
And I'm like, well.
And you're like, I'm a kid.
I'm a kid.
Yeah,
I don't know. You can't put that on me. But also, being the Aboriginal kid of my high school class, it's like, as those lessons in history class come up about, we're going to have the Indian lesson or the Native American lesson. It's like all the eyes are just like behind me.
Yeah.
So it's that push and pull.
That really is. That's a perfect way to describe it, push and pull. Let me open it up to the three of you then. Let's talk about internal stereotypes within the community. I mean, I can speak, being in the South Asian community, how it's, you kind of have to do everything. So yeah, you want your career, fine, but you also have to cook, you got to clean, you got to do all these things as a woman that's South Asian. Are there any kind of internal stereotypes that you face from your community? You kind of alluded to that you need to be more Black, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's tough because it's like when I grew up in Scarborough, there was that stereotype, or a lot of people in my area were into gangster rap, and like 50 Cent was big at the time, Get Rich Die Trying had just come out, and everyone's rocking the G Unit t-shirts. Meanwhile, I was more interested in listening to like Common or Talib Kweli, or artists like that who actually had like a message behind it. Or maybe one day I want to listen to Good Charlotte, or you know what I mean? It was just, I had a very eclectic taste in music, but to my friends or people in my area, it was, well, we're going to call you top 40. We're going to make fun of you and give you these nicknames because you're not really down with the culture. You're not really Black enough to our standards. So that was hard to deal with.
You had, Teeshia, I was going to turn this over to you because you had also an experience with music. I mean, your musical taste, some say, doesn't match you.
Exactly. I still get this a lot, actually, just because of the type of music I listen to. My husband, actually, he's a comedian, so he made a joke about this where I'd have headphones on and he would say, you look like the sweetest girl, and then you take your headphones off and the music that comes out of it, you just wouldn't expect that from you. Like, why do you even listen to that?
So and what kind of music are we talking about here?
In this particular instance, he was talking about, because I like to listen to like hardcore music and I like to listen to rock, so he's like, I would never expect that from you. And I was like, well, don't you think that's kind of a double standard? Because at the same time, you're not a person of color. Like, he is white and he listens to like gangster rap. And I was like, well, people wouldn't expect that of you. Why?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because you're right. It is when there's somebody of color who's like super into rock music
Yeah.
or heavy metal. It's a
People look at it
question
too.
mark. Yeah, my husband grew up like that as well. Yeah.
Hearing everyone speak, it reminds me of like that feeling of you don't belong in the community and you don't belong in mainstream society. Kind of, you're not good enough here and not good enough out there. So I wear a hijab now, but there was a time in my life where I stopped wearing it for a few years because it didn't feel like something that I wanted as part of my life. And it's just amazing that, like, I see how differently I'm treated by non-Muslims, like in terms of stereotypes that I get when I'm wearing hijab, and then I see how I'm not treated that way when I'm not wearing hijab. But by the Muslim community or some members of the Muslim community, when I stopped wearing hijab, like, you would think that I had, I don't know, like cut off my arm or something. Like, it was just like, I'm okay, really, you know? And I think, you know, one thing I really, you know, wish that the community would do more is not to put so much pressure on Muslim women to look a certain way or act a certain way, because Muslim women are already dealing with Islamophobia in society at large. So we don't need extra pressure from the community to, you know, fit a certain standard or, you know, dress or act in a certain way to please people. Like, I am so done living that way, right? But that pressure is really big. And I related to what you were saying about, you know, especially if you hear criticism from elders, it's like, it's really painful, because here we are trying to connect with our cultures in this society, and then if we get feedback from our cultures being like, well, you failed, like it hurts, right? And so hopefully that can be bridged. Yeah.
You know, it's not just in person, but it's also online as well, right? Where there was this post about this guy from the Netherlands who had learned Anishinaabe Moen, which is Ojibwe, fluently. And there's this video of him speaking it for like 3 minutes. And it's like, oh, wow, you know, that's really great. I'm really proud of him. Because he took like this amazing Anishinaabe Moen program in the States, in Minnesota. And, you know, but the caption is this guy from the Netherlands, you know, he learned this he learned the Anishinaabe Moen language. And, you know, the final line is, there's no excuse for you to not learn your language. But it's like that person is also not dealing with the trauma of having to pick up a language that was essentially killed out of people.
Right.
And so there's that part that a lot of people don't understand, where they're like, you know, back in my day, we didn't talk about triggers or trauma. And it's like, no, like, you're living now. Like, we have.
We're not there. Yeah.
We're not there anymore.
Right.
We're going to talk about it now, openly.
Yeah, we need to. And I mean, that's part of having this conversation, right? That probably wouldn't have been had. I really want to talk about something that I've been wanting to talk about for so long, and I can't wait to get your insight and input about it. It's those words. Where are you really from? I feel like I get that all the time. And I say I'm from Canada, and people are like, oh, no. Where are you really from? You know, and some people would say that, okay, well, you know, I'm not saying it in a mean way. I just really am curious about your culture. But to me, that's great. Then ask where my grandparents are from or where my parents are from. But I feel like it really others you to say, where are you from? Like, you couldn't belong here. Have you guys had the similar experience, and how have you dealt with it, and how do you feel about it?
Yeah, 100%. It's funny, I had this discussion with my dad this morning. We're listening to the radio, and he said, you know, you're Canadian, right? And it was a conversation that was happening. He's like, you're Canadian. Like, you're the only one in this household that was born here. All my family was born in Jamaica. And I was like, yeah, but I mean, what do I say? I'm like, Canadian Jamaican, right? But he's like, no, you're Canadian. Like, you were born here, type of thing. So it's something that's always come up, because I feel like people would always assume I'm not Jamaican enough to be of Jamaican heritage. I even remember one instance where someone told me I'm too passive, or I'm not aggressive enough to be Jamaican, because they assume all Jamaicans are loud and, you know, or smoking weed or whatever, right? And that's not me per se. So for me, it's something I've always dealt with, where it's like people can't really believe that I'm from the West Indies, I'm from the Caribbean background, because I don't fit into what they think that person should be.
What about you? Have you heard that? Where are you really from?
Definitely. And so I was born in Toronto, so, you know, technically I'm from here, and people have always, you know, done what you said, the follow-up question. You know, if I say I'm from Toronto, I'm from Canada, well, where, like, tell me more, like, what about your parents? And it used to really make me feel really, I guess, angry, and just, you know, wanting people to really accept me. No, I am Canadian. You need to, like, it should stop there, and don't ask me anything further. But more recently, it hasn't bothered me as much, or I haven't, I guess, let it bother me as much. And I've decided that, you know what, I'm going to think more about the fact that, because if I say, no, I really belong here, I'm really from here, then what about Indigenous communities? I'm a part of the settler community, right? And as soon as I started looking at it that way, I stopped getting as angry when people said, where are you really from? I think it's good to then ask, especially if it's a white person asking, like, well, where are you really from? Because, you know, then pointing again that, you know, your ancestors came here too, and what's that about too? Because I think that's where it all started in terms of picturing Canada as a white country. It's from colonization. That's the image people have in their minds. That's why when they see me, I don't fit into that image. So yeah, it used to bother me, but that's really helped me put it in its place.
For me personally, I'm a part of the group of Indigenous people that wouldn't identify as Canadian and wouldn't identify with Canadian culture or Canadiana in a sense. I mean, they still ask, where am I from? But it's like, I have to tell them that I'm from a reserve, and they're like, well, what is that? Because a lot of Canadians don't know what a reserve is at all. It's
they have
really
a stereotype about
they have
what
a
it is,
stereotype
right.
of what a reserve is, but they don't understand that, you know, if you drive like 3 minutes down a hill from North Bay, Ontario, you're gonna find the reserve. You just drive by it and you don't realize it. And so there's not only misinformation, but not even a collection of information. And it's an unwillingness, definitely, to learn about what a reserve is.
Yeah, Teeshia, do you ever get that, where you're really from, and how do you feel about it?
I used to get that question a lot. I don't get it as much as now. But as Sidrah said, like, a lot of people would ask me, and that I would just, after I would tell them, I'm Canadian, where are your parents from? They're also Canadian, born here, and they're like, no, they're not. And I was like, yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
But then I would just return the question, well, where are you
really
from?
And I think
And
that's a
then
great
most
way
of the
to handle
time,
it.
a lot of people who are asking me that are not born here.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just kind of weird why you're asking me that.
Yeah, no, I think it's I mean, it's the first thing you say, but when it gets a little bit like, okay, really, like, you know, it's that disbelief, that's what bugs me.
Yeah, I think it's funny. What you mentioned actually made me start thinking about that question in a different light, but then it kind of makes me a little bit, I don't want to say sad, but I kind of start reflecting on, you know, the culture of Black people in this country, because then it's, well, where are we really from? And then if I trace it back to my family, well, where are they really from? So now I kind of feel lost because I feel I don't really know those roots. Yeah, I know my mom's like a descendant of the Maroons who, like, they helped fight off colonization, but I don't know how far that goes back. So now I'm wondering, well, where am I really from? Like, what's the true background?
It makes you question identity. I mean, I think that's what a lot of people who aren't POCs really struggle with. The other thing that I think is interesting is kind of these backhanded compliment, microaggressions type things. And I'll give you an example. Somebody said to me, somebody pretty prominent in the city was saying, you know, you're not Indian, Farah. If I scratch your skin underneath, you're really white. Wow. And and it really bugged me. It really bugged me. It still bugs me even talking about it because, you know, no, I am Indian.
Yeah.
Of course I'm Indian. And what does that even mean, you know?
Yeah.
Have you ever faced, and they thought, again, they were complimenting me. Have you, any of you faced anything like that?
Wow.
Oh, that's okay.
I know I have personally. I get like I'll get a lot of comments like, "Oh, you're pretty for a Black girl," and it's like, what does that even mean? Why can't I just be pretty for anyone, really? And it's just kind of confusing because I think, and I'm like, this is how I'm gonna live my life? Like, people don't see me more than just the color of my skin. I just remember a conversation my grandmother had with me, and she's like, you're gonna have to try harder at everything you do. You're gonna have to be better.
Oh, yeah.
Because people are just gonna see you for the color of your skin and nothing more.
I definitely have that same sort of feeling, not with looks, but more in how I speak. I've often been told, you know, you speak really well for a Black guy, or which is crazy to even hear, right? But I know even doing interviews over the phone, if I talk to someone over the phone and I go in to meet them, there's that moment where it's never addressed, but there's that moment where I can see it in their eye. They're like, oh, like that's not who I was expecting to see.
I feel like you want to jump in on that phone call thing. You're just nodding your head. That happens to you too.
The phone thing has happened to me too, where I'll speak to someone on the phone, and for my work, often I'll have long conversations, you know, like conference calls. So we're getting to know each other, we have a rapport, and when I meet them in person, I see the wheels are turning. They're just like, you are the one I've been talking to. Yeah, and it's almost made me want to meet people on the phone first, because it's almost like I can give a certain impression on the phone that you can't get at as easily if they see you.
No,
so
it's true.
Do you guys think, and I'm gonna, since you're already talking about, I think this is interesting coming from you first. Do you think it's our responsibility to educate people? Do you think it is, or do you think it's up to them to educate themselves on these type of things?
So my answer is kind of jaded because I've tried. In the past, I used to really put it upon myself to educate people and try to disprove stereotypes, and like that's how I grew up, and so it was very exhausting. But recently, I've taken that responsibility off of my shoulders, and I don't believe that it's people of color's job to educate racist people about racism. I just think it's asking too much, because you're dealing with the racism and then you're having to explain to people why they're being racist. And I've seen examples recently that are really inspiring to me of white people who have done their homework about racism and are passionate about making change, talking to other white people about racism, you know, talking to their family members, you know, explaining why it's not okay to say certain things or make certain assumptions. I feel like that, because it's a lot of work, right? And it's asking people with privilege to do that work, I feel, is a better way for me to move forward. And I just focus more now on supporting my community or people who are going through discrimination. I focus my energy on supporting them rather than trying to change
And there's
others.
people, and I know you've said this, I'm going to turn it over to Cole next, but there's people who are going through not microaggressions, who are dealing with serious prejudice, who can't get jobs, who are going through who are dealing with poverty, people in Indigenous communities, you know, people who are living in marginalized communities. Let's talk about that, Cole. Do you think it's up to us to educate in these big ways, for example? Or do you think it's up to people to educate themselves?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that no person of color is a consultant unless that's their job position. And you know, if people want to ask me like a off question, right? If people want to ask me an off question where it's like, you know, like what does your medallion mean? Then that's fine, because that's just like a personal question. We're getting into conversation. But when it's, you know, like you know, like can you explain to me, like what's this water crisis going on reserve? And I'm like, you know, write a contract for me and I'll talk to you about it, because it's to a point, like the same with you, where I'm just not gonna have it anymore, in terms of like free consulting about these issues that are traumatic. And you know, I find that non-people of color, non-Indigenous people, they don't understand that when they ask certain questions, those can be very triggering and very traumatic, and especially with the intergenerational trauma that often affects all Indigenous people within this country. It can bring up a lot of awful memories or a lot of awful conversations with family members.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something that I think most people don't even think about, right?
Yeah.
That it's so complex and has so many layers. And this was all about learning, and I've learned a lot. I thank you all for sharing your comments, and I thank you for watching Living in Color. Thank you for watching Living in Color. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have an idea for a future Living in Color episode, we'd love your thoughts. Leave them in the comment section.